Welcome, everybody. I'm going to start on time because time is precious. I'm Vivian and chairing this session, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome our keynote speakers, Khawla, Alison and Hyab. It also brings back for me very fond memories of my time at the University of Glasgow, where I had the honour to meet Alison and work with her. And what's always impressed me is about the creativity and the commitment to bringing research, policy and practice into meaningful and purposeful relationships. I'm not going to say any more because they're going to tell you about their story and about their work. And you don't want to hear me as the chair paraphrasing it badly. So I'm going to hand over, and there should be time at the end for some questions. There are people with microphones who will be able to assist when we come to that part of the programme. So welcome everybody, and I'll hand over to my colleagues.
Thank you so much, Vivian. It's so lovely to have this opportunity to work with you and see you again and see you looking so well. And thank you to Vera for the kind invitation, and especially, and maybe a round of applause to Marie, who has worked tirelessly organising us. And I'd also like to just say kia ora to my colleagues in the parallel plenary symposium at the moment, who've come a very, very long way. I would love to know what they're saying because of my long history and association with Aotearoa New Zealand. But I'm really hoping that that session goes well, and good luck to them in what they wish to say. We have prepared a talk which will last about an hour. We've scripted it, so we're going to be quite close to text. But we'll obviously come up from it. And we do also, of course, have slides to accompany us. I'd also like to thank Diane for her plenary yesterday, which laid a lot of the historical groundwork for much of what we will be saying, focusing on the present. The Arabic word Ashlaa refers to scattered body parts and dismembered flesh and bones. This joint keynote is delivered from within our physical bodies, the physical bodies of 3 educators and researchers, Hyab, Khawla, and myself. We are fearful, experienced, and clear. We speak from Edouard Glissant's open circle, knowing that these times demand more than one voice in plenary, and that education must once again become a poetics of relation. We speak in the aftermath of the provisional orders of the International Court of Justice in January 2024, and following the United Nations declaration of an official famine in Gaza this summer. We speak at a time in the United Kingdom when small, extreme, far-right protests receive unprecedented media attention and accommodation, and when the UK government uses language which no educator aligned with UNESCO's values of peace education could ever justify. We speak after the First Minister of Scotland, where Hyab and I live, stated, "Let's be clear, a genocide is unfolding in Gaza as a result of Israel's actions," and who instituted a military boycott in accordance with the International Court of Justice orders, and Scotland became the first nation to institute BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. When we wrote the abstract for this plenary earlier this year, it was during a period of forced starvation and the expulsion and ethnic cleansing of a people. Around 88,000 students at that time, 3,000 educators in higher education in the Gaza Strip were searching through the rubble for the remains of their working lives, their students, their colleagues, their books, their university buildings. Famine had yet to be officially declared, though the painstaking work of investigation was ongoing by my colleagues in the United Nations. 90% of schools were already severely damaged, according to assessments by the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, which was soon to be banned when we wrote our abstract from operating at all, let alone educating Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories and in the Gaza Strip. We must now update those figures, increase the percentages and the numbers, even as we also face what is, scholars agree, the 10th stage of genocide, denial. UNRWA has now been banned from operating. A private company, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, distributes aid while reportedly shooting at those to whom the aid is distributed. Education on every level is profoundly disrupted there and here. Higher education infrastructure has been erased. My colleagues of 15 years consecutively are eating one meal every 3 days. In Zoom conversations, as we attempt to enable education in an emergency, we see their homes shake with bombardments. We hear drones. One of my PhD students awaiting evacuation has been displaced 14 times and submitted her Kara scholarship application from the roof of a 4-story building under gunfire. In Ukraine, the Russian aggression rages on. The death toll rises. Ukrainians in the UK start their own refugee language schools for their children, joining many others that form the informal refugee language education landscape. A few Sudanese, Eritrean, Afghan, Ethiopian, Congolese make it to the hostile UK on boats, fleeing from persecution, trafficking, war, landing to be greeted by the mania of xenophobia unleashed as mobs and draped in the flags of the land. What awaits them is a broken asylum system, requirements to learn English, and an ESOL system, which you know only too well, is chronically underfunded. Meanwhile, community ESOL, the euphemism for what happens when those failed by the state begin to do the work themselves, is offered as a policy solution. Maybe it is. Maybe it is where the menace of hope pulses on, restoring life. Each of us presenting today has been made and remade and unmade through refugee experiences of differing kinds, and now profoundly through the Gaza famine and Gaza genocide. We have experienced our spirits, our bodies, our languages as Ashlaa, scattered fragments. For me, during previous aggressions on the Gaza Strip, it was the metallic taste of fear mingling with the sound of drones, bombings, and evacuations. For Hyab, it was the hands of traffickers and torturers during his search for refuge, and in his work protecting victims of the same. For Khawla, it was the bombs that shattered the broken windows and half-standing walls of her home in Gaza, and the silence that denied these war crimes. The erasure of her people, past and present, and the banning of a just future for Palestinians in their land. All of this taking place in the void and absence of discussion in spaces across higher education like this. For Hyab and myself, Gaza is not the only context of forced displacement and war crimes under international law. We have family and colleagues in Sudan, Eritrea, and Egypt. I'm involved deeply with both the Scottish Government's and the community's responses to the Ukraine Humanitarian Resettlement Scheme, the Afghan Resettlement Scheme, the Syrian Vulnerable Persons Resettlement Scheme, the Hong Kong BNO Resettlement Scheme, and now, right now, those decisions being taken between 2 and 4 today, with the Gaza student evacuations. And for all of us, as language is torn apart, propagandized, its meanings placed under erasure, we live and breathe the multiple failures and abyssal realities of refugee experience, which tear us apart day in and day out. We are profoundly acquainted with grief. And it is from this place, friends and colleagues, which makes a mockery of any educational research claims to objectivity, that we insist on speaking through the concept of Ashlaa, of our experience, and from within the pedagogies of language education in times of failure and heartbreak. Nadera Shalhoub Kaverikan, an anthropologist, writes, centering Ashlaa unsettles the totalizing perception of annihilation by insisting on burials for the dead. It makes meaning out of the loving acts, your loving acts, to collect and protect the scattered dead, to remember the dismembered. Whilst our bodies respond with the thudding effects of trauma, past and present, we are not Ashlaa in the sense that Shalhoub Kaverikan writes of. Our minds, words, and spirits may scatter repeatedly, but our bodies are more or less intact. We are alive, we are witnesses, we are educators and researchers like you. Ashlaa, as a concept, might enable us to undertake our work collectively as it enables us to undertake our work. It is a concept that articulates with integrity the experience of all those whose languages are forced into monolingually framed curricula, whose families are now denied reunion, and who are scattered parts of the familial body. Ashlaa, scattered, torn, are the words we are denied, the words which lose their meaning under directives and contestations about the abyssal realities and wounds out of which refugee language education must rise and be constituted. When crowbarred into the discourses of liberal education of the past, these are bound to fail. The old certainties of consensus surrounding liberal education and liberal peace building are in tatters. Teachers and learners are once again cast adrift, unmoored from the language discourse and proper forms of orderly, peaceful pedagogies, which they have been taught can make them safe. One of the things that I turn to when I am struggling in meetings in higher education, committee meetings that you will recognise all too well, is I turn to poetry. From policy to poetry. Transfer the knowledge, bank the education. Roll it out, I tell you, across China. Fill the 7 seas with these words, these my words, and these ways, these my ways. May all be competent, efficient, competent, captured, efficient, competent. Yes, I repeat, professional, competent. It is our settled will that having settled our will, we will settle for competence, efficiency, professionalism. This is the policy. Ours, our policy. This will deliver up a curriculum for excellence, standards for success, and across the 7 seas, across 7, there will be competence between us and excellence, and ceaseless efficiency and professional success. And between us, there will be success, I say, standards, quality, and of the rolling out, there will be no end. In place of rest, efficiency. In place of beauty, excellence. In place of diversity and national standards, in place of brokenness and the tenderness, which is learning's due, qualities raw. In place of dancing, rolling out. And there, look, in the path of those excellent rollers, violets. There were, crushed now, violets. If wars are made in the minds of people, says the UNESCO founding documents, then it's in the minds of people that the defences of peace must be constructed. This begins with language. The late great scholar Walter Brueggemann says that the script of therapeutic, technocratic, consumer militarism that socializes us all has failed. It cannot make us safe, and it cannot make us happy. As such, we insist here on destituting the structures of violence in our educational language systems and discursive regimes. We dust ourselves down daily in order to show what we have researched and know again and again, that Freire's pedagogies of hope and freedom can be made, even here. These pedagogies and their adaptations can unstick us from the sticky knowledge and valuable skills discourse that underpins the reality of paralysis and fear, and through learning and unlearning, create oases of education as sanctuary, schools of sanctuary, universities of sanctuary. Each of us has gathered examples through our research over many years with refugees and as refugees, and especially with Gaza. These examples demonstrate the possibilities of pedagogies beyond the abyss, pedagogies of care, lexicons of love, and purposeful decentering of powers with humour and beauty. As UNESCO Chair for Refugee Education, through education, languages and arts, it's my job to understand the structures which enable life to carry on beyond the violence and persecution of what Hyab terms in his book, The Refugee Abyss. UNHCR in particular have worked with governments worldwide to set standards and offer examples of good practice for refugee education. 15 by 30, for instance, refers to the aim set in the Global Forum for Refugees of having 15% of all recognised refugees in higher education by 2030. The good news, that went up by 2% last year. These are the starting points, but it's in schools, in formal education, in communities, in universities and colleges, in community language classes, led by people like Isol Linda. You all know an Isol Linda somewhere. And in insistent multilingualism, that practical pedagogies of hope, of inclusive expression, of utterance beyond the unutterable can be made. Pedagogies are, as we all know, practices that need modelling and modelling anew. We cannot talk about decolonial or decentered education or anti-genocidal education without also practicing it, clumsy as that will be. And so I'm delighted that Bira, after some persuading, agreed that I might do this with the privilege of my invited plenary and ask two experts with profound experience that is alive from the violence, the heartbreak and the failure to share their research on language education as with and for all who are profoundly unmoored and exiled from the certainties and normality of life in this moment and as part of serving education with refugees. What, in such a time of failure, aporia, and heartbreak, is responsible educational research and teaching? What might a pedagogy of heartbreak look like? What are the pedagogies of the abyss, and from whom might we best learn?
In addressing pedagogies of the abyss, I will offer three preliminary reflections. First, naming the world from the position of the refugee. For us refugees, education begins by naming our condition. It begins by speaking from a place of dispossession, from the voice of displaced people who have nothing left to lose, having lost everything, including faith in this world. This act of naming points towards what might be called pedagogies of the abyss, a pedagogy of open wounds and scars, expressed in crying, wailing, bearing witness, and lamenting. Yet, it's not merely a lament for our own condition, but for the condition of a world that has become violent, indifferent, and unlivable. Epistemically, pedagogies of the abyss are about connecting traces of survival and piecing them together in a transcendent relation beyond the abyss itself. The condition that befalls refugees is what I have elsewhere called the refugee abyss. This abyss begins the moment one becomes a refugee, a status in which the only right is the right to endure rightlessness or to perish without rights. Let me illustrate this with the stories of three friends, Abraham, Sarah, and Hassan. These friends survived arbitrary detention. They endured indefinite national service. They lived under constant threat of war in Eritrea. Under such conditions, fleeing their homeland became a necessity. During their escape, they were kidnapped by traffickers while crossing fortified borders. They survived ransom extortion, torture, sexual violence, and organ harvesting. Eventually, they reached Cairo with their pain still raw, and they sought asylum. The registration process took nearly 2 years. Amid this long and uncertain wait, a glimmer of hope appeared in the form of resettlement to the US through a community sponsorship initiative known as the Welcome Corps. This program allowed a group of 5, including family or close friends, to support an application for resettlement. With the help of friends, all 3 submitted their applications. After months of vetting, they were granted visas. Their flights were scheduled for February 2025. As part of the standard procedures, they closed their UNHCR files, secured exit visas from Egypt, and packed their bags, believing they were beginning a new life. Then Trump came to power. His administration defunded resettlement programs and canceled the refugees' visas. Their hope collapsed. Their UNHCR files were closed. Their legal presence in Egypt was revoked. Their resettlement visas were canceled. 2 weeks ago, they were detained by Egyptian authorities and deported back to Eritrea. These refugees have been stripped of the place where they once sustained their physical existence. Their bodies are reduced to violable, killable, and disposable corporealities. Fanon calls this condition amputation of being, one that separates the body from its humanity and murders the latter, leaving only flesh and bone exposed to the abyss. What remains is not a life, but an amputated body staring into its own grave. The grave of humanity that Fanon had in mind was the Atlantic Ocean, the slave ship, the plantation, the colony, metropole. Today, that grave is the Mediterranean, where thousands vanish without a trace. It's the asylum colonies, disguised as refugee camps, shanty towns, hotspots, temporary shelters, and so forth. It's Gaza, an ongoing colony where genocide unfolds before our eyes. Sudan, Ukraine, Yemen, Syria, Myanmar, and so many other places. These new graves of humanity map the coordinates of Ashlaa that Alison spoke of. The refugee abyss is also married with grammars of coloniality and raciality. These grammars constructed the figure of the refugee as a nameless, a threat, as one whose presence justifies punishment without consequence. We are told we are invaders, but no one speaks of the doctors, nurses, carers, and essential workers among us. We're accused of bringing disease, but that is a lie, and I bear no burden to prove it false. We are not here to build an island of strangers. We are here because bombs and sanctions from islands like this one in collusion with the regimes of their former colonies, have made us refugees. Such tropes constitute the syntax and the structure of unnaming. They weaponize law, they mobilize public fear, they racialize people, they marginalize communities. They refuse to name the structural violence that produces the refugee base. Instead, they impose names we are not meant to question, names designed to control, contain, and dehumanize us. As the world order trembles, we are still cast into the abyss, along with all life forms and the fragile conditions that make life possible, pushed to the very edge of erasure. And those of us who have survived this far continue to ask, does the world know we exist? The praxis of rural existence, beyond the naming of the abyss, lies a slow, tedious, and often exhausting, yet life-affirming praxis of rural existence. Such praxis create the conditions of possibility for preserving life, for making movement possible, and for restoring dignity in the wastelands of coloniality. It emerges in the cracks, in fugitive spaces, in places where life begins anew, in shadows, undergrounds, and beyond the dehumanization of unwanted names. Our first task as refugees is to learn how to stay alive. The preservation of life is inseparably bound to movement. For us, to move is to find cracks, to create new ones, and to clear paths for survival in the face of refugee abyss. This knowledge of limits and rudderals enable us to move, step away from violence, and to drift, however precariously, towards safety and dignity, even when our lives remain exposed to the risk of perishability. In this struggle for the preservation of life, knowledge becomes an embodied praxis of rural existence. The question then is this: how do we arrive at a position of possibility for knowledge and relation beyond masks, beyond the naked bodies? We do not have answers to this question. Instead, we sit within Glissant's open circle of the known and the unknown, celebrating its communion while curious of its obscurities, remaining respectful of its opacity. In this act of sitting that resists settling, we follow Glissant in placing relation before ontology, recognizing that the unknown exceeds any fixed positionality, spatiality, or temporality. To place relation before ontology is to unsettle ontology itself, disrupt its Heideggerian fixation on being and time. We are less concerned with what something is than with how it relates to us and those around us. To invoke the unknown is to attend to that which lies beyond understanding or conceptual grasp. Attuned to this infinite ungraspability of the unknown, we do not merely acknowledge the ineffable, the sublime, and the radical alterity. We embody humility and openness towards what cannot be fully known, measured, defined, or categorized. Let me offer by a way of practical example a glimpse into the archives of Eritrean coffee ceremony with its intimate stories and everyday sanctuaries. The ceremony typically unfolds in 3 stages: preparation, serving, and sharing. Each of these stages is imbued with wisdom. The coffee ceremony is a holding space for both life and loss, the meditation on the cycles of life, a restorative and generative space for imagining the otherwise. Its poetic principles of non-exclusion, understood as an invitation to radical openness, and of non-violence, are grounded in relation. Relation, openness, an aperture into position of possibility, of sanctuary, of hospitality, and of refuge beyond the abyss. There's more on this in the blog, which will go tomorrow, live tomorrow. Language and the pedagogies of the abyss. Forced displacement strips refugees of their mother tongues, followed by the slow violence of forced assimilation, often disguised as an integration. They are denied the right to speak, name, to remember, or to write in the language that once carried their heritage. The former refugee and parent, I dwell at the border between carrying my ancestral language forward and witnessing its slow death. Each lost word marks the slow extinction of a world. This is not merely a fading of a grammar or vocabulary, the linguicide that erodes our capacity to name the world, renew our rituals. With the loss of language, the coffee ritual begins to fade. It loses its breath, rhythm of life, and soul. Anon reminds us that to speak is to exist absolutely for the other. But in what language do we affirm this existence when no language remains? In what language do we address the other, whose precarious being demands our speech and whose gaze unsettles our own? Can a language founded on denial bear the weight of responsibility, relation, and care? Can it witness a world trembling beneath the forced displacement, genocide, and erasure? How do we speak to the other whose otherness we have marked and distanced, whose humanity we have torn apart in silence? Or have we become so fluent in silence, so rehearsed in denial, that we no longer remember how to exist for the other at all? And what becomes of education, this broken promise, when it no longer speaks to the ethical, political, and existential? What remains of education when speaking has lost its relation to the listener? I leave you with these questions, for questions are what remain when existing systems of knowledge fade into obsolescence.
Friends and colleagues, thank you so much for being with us here. I'm sure as we all entered this room, we knew that we are going to listen to something difficult. So I would like to start by thanking you for coming, for being ready to hear about the failure and the heartbreak of education. My trigger warning is different. My trigger warning to you all is this talk is going to be very tender. My name is Khawla Badwan. I am a reader in applied linguistics at Manchester Metropolitan University. I am a third-generation Palestinian refugee. I speak to you as my family are in Gaza, and an hour ago, they were packing their lives in bags, saying goodbye to our house. They actually sent me a video of our house. Please allow me to go back to basics. Please allow me to go back to basics, to beginnings, as Palestinian scholar Edward Said tells us. Edward Said instructs us to go back to beginnings because this can stimulate self-conscious and situated activity, activity with aims non-coercive and communal. I stand here in front of this bureau audience and I ask, what is education for? What are we educating towards? I'm sure many people in this room and many others outside this room will have different views on this matter. Politicians in particular are very concerned about education, which is packaged in terms of targets, hubs, inspection reports. Sorry, they're called cards these days. And let's not forget the league tables. This is education. All devised to see education as a coercive space, reduced to sticky knowledge, as Ofsted likes to call it, and valuable skills, as the Department for Education likes to remind us. But I'm sure I'm not alone in taking issues with this reductionist, harmful vision for education. In addressing the question, what is education for? I would like to draw on Jackson's view of education as a moral enterprise at root. Moral enterprise at root. This view needs to be the most prominent view in times of failure, genocide, surveillance, and silence. Education is a moral enterprise at root. This is because if we fail to see education as a moral enterprise, and if we fail to see educators as truth tellers, there remains no driving and unifying ideal, no coherent set of values from which to engage morally and critically with powerful agencies which seek to use education for their own material and political ends, as Richard Ping warns us. And here we are, friends and colleagues, here we are. We're asked to educate with no values. We're asked to educate with complete disregard of international law and the post-World War II order, including the Universal Declaration for Human Rights that guarantees a right to life, liberty, and the security of person. We are asked to educate with complete disregard for the Convention on the Prevention and the Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Oh no, don't call it genocide. We are here with no unifying ideals, stuck in discourses of denial and the pretense of impartiality, looking at one another, wondering, what do we call this mass killing of an entire trapped civilian population enabled by our own government, funded by our own universities, which are operating on genocidal mode, under claims of research neutrality, while remaining structurally dependent on settler colonial collaborations and funding, as Francesca Albanese tells us. And all of this is brushed under the carpet of silence and silencing. Friends and colleagues, we are here with no coherent set of values that enable moral engagement with the necropolitics of creating death worlds around us. Death worlds in Sudan, Ukraine, Congo, Afghanistan, Palestine, including the live stream death world from Gaza, which has been so far hit by bombs equivalent to 6 Hiroshimas. More child deaths than any conflict, and the highest number of child amputees in the world. The genocide in Gaza affects us all. It affects all social aspects of our lives. It hits us in the core of what it means to be human and stay human in times characterized by moral blindness and apathy. Make no mistake, the genocide in Gaza is not an unfortunate event unfolding in a faraway strip of land. It is a place brought to every corner of the world through unprecedented economic, technological, and military entanglements. If Gaza were a crime scene, Francesca Albanese tells us, Gaza would have had all of our fingerprints all over its rubble. I hope many of you refuse to eat the Kit Kat bar in your brown bag. That is an example of our fingerprints all over Gaza's rubble. But why Gaza? My contribution here centers the genocide in Gaza as an exemplar of the failures of so many systems and orders, including education. We have failed to prevent genocide, and we are all responsible. We have failed to prevent genocide when we turned our backs on the cultural manufacturing of genocide, when we turned our backs on anti-Palestinian racism, when we turned our backs on hatred, Islamophobia, white supremacy, land theft, and coloniality, and we called it, we are playing impartiality. We are all part of the manufacturing, the cultural manufacturing of genocide. But rather than surrendering to hopelessness and despair, I here urge you to let this failure be a catalyst. I'd like you to leave this room and say, we've heard something from a Palestinian whose family is under genocide, and her words were, let Gaza be your catalyst. Let Gaza be a catalyst for worlding education. We can reworld education right here, together from this very theatre room at this very specific annual conference of educators. I know many of you are scared. Many of you are hesitant, doubtful, lost. It is safer to cling to the familiar. It's safer to cling to the business as usual of ignoring genocide. It's easy to put our failing theories, language, systems, and orders on life support. We know they're dead, we know they're dying, but it's easy to put them on life support because we're scared of the void that will be left in their place if we admit that they are dead and dying. But no more. Let us remain in agony, friends and colleagues. Let us remain in agony with a focus to re-world education. Agony is important. Isabella Hamad says, to remain human at this juncture is to remain in agony. Let us remain there is the most honest place from which to speak. To live life a genocide away. To live life a genocide away, except it is not away and there is no away. But there is only one way: to speak up, stand up, and show up. To do well, live well, and die well, while a genocide away. Some of you would challenge this moral imperative to show up, speak up, stand up in education. They would want to remind us of the guidance on the balance of views and the need to maintain political impartiality. I mean, how can we say this without laughing at this stage? A balance of views and political impartiality. To this group of people, I say, I hear you. I've been hearing almost no other responses from education but this for 2 years. I have heard you enough. But here is the painful truth. The painful truth is there is no impartiality. Let me elaborate on that. There is no impartiality. There is no impartiality when Gaza is being bombed by weapons manufactured in the UK with assistance of UK spying planes and the political cover of most UK politicians and mainstream media. There is no impartiality when the historical making of Gaza as a strip of land inhabited by refugees happened due to the British colonial rule in Palestine. I am a third-generation Palestinian refugee today because of the British mandate in Palestine. And my family are stuck under bombs in Gaza because of the British mandate in Palestine. There is no impartiality. There is no impartiality when the UK is partial to this iconic struggle for justice that has spanned across 77 years and counting. So what do we say if we have to replace the word impartial? What do we say? Factual is the word. We heard this from Gary Lineker. Factual is the word. I have another painful truth for you. Pedagogy is always political. Own it. Own it. Following the footsteps of critical educators such as Paulo Freire, we learn that education is always political. I recently read an amazing LinkedIn post from Philip Proudfoot where he says, and listen to that carefully because it's so powerful. He says, to insist that all lives have equal value is, and always has been, an act of disruption. For everyone who cares about inclusion, anti-racism, EDI, decoloniality, justice, equality, tackling disadvantage, special education needs, safeguarding, all the buzzwords in education, let me tell you, our work is inherently political and there is nothing wrong with that. Do not let the fear of using the word conceal the awful truth around the human struggles around you. Pedagogy is political, and indeed, every political struggle is always a struggle over pedagogy, over who shapes the common sense of society. Pedagogy is a tool to govern, to world, to shape the future. And we are here, friends and colleagues, standing on shaking and shaken grounds. And we need urgent thinking to move forward with pedagogies of care. The choice is yours. And I hope you do stand on the right side of history as well as the right side of the book. As you can see from this beautiful illustration from a Finnish artist and activist, Anu. Many of us in this room are familiar with the work of Judith Butler, who talks to us about grievability, and her work raises lots of questions that are related to our life today, about the selection, allocation of grievability. Whose lives do we grieve? Who is just living? Who is having a life? Whose lives do we just dismiss as unfortunate, political, too complex to comment on? I don't know enough to talk about. To grieve is to attend to the world and mourn what is taken, killed, bombed, and denied. To grieve is to feel the world's brokenness and to sit with life and death. To grieve is to stay alive, to teach life despite the rituals of attending to the dead, even as life becomes impossible. And their amazing work, Linguistic Disobedience, Julia Komska, Michelle Moyd, and David Gramling ask a really important question. They say, What everyday antidotes are there to shock events, gaslighting, denial, deflection, and everything else that renews the daily prospect of losing one's mind? What can help us regain our minds? I am attempting a response to this question, admitting the impossibility of a full response. And I would like, in my response, to outline 3 elements of what I call a pedagogy of care, which is an antidote to help us find our minds, our words, and our worlds. I outline these 3 elements and details in a recent publication where I discuss a reparative praxis with Gaza, and you can see the link on the slide. The 3 elements are: number 1, find language. Develop your reparative lexicon with Gaza. Challenge the silence and silencing. Challenge the, I don't know, it's too complicated. Educate yourself and develop language and find language. There can be no justice, no reparation without language that breaks the silence on Gaza. Find your voice. Engage with credible reports from international and local credible sources. Remember, factual is the word. Number 2, move forward with wounds. Develop your pedagogies of care. There is no neat recipe for what these pedagogies look like, but we know what care and caring feels like. The choice is yours. You can insist on being in denial, refusing to open your eyes to the moral wounds of living in genocidal times. There is always an alternative. You can open your mind and your heart to the collective wounds of witnessing Gaza and the decimation of its children. I hope you choose the latter, which will then help you develop your own pedagogies of care through transforming classrooms into spaces of healing and caring. We are an audience of educators. I'm not going to educate you on how to do that. We can draw on arts, stories, poetry, music, drawing, dancing, creative practice. All of these things are pedagogical tools. Number 3, let Gaza be a catalyst for fairer educational presence and futures. Reparative educational futures insist on the importance of metabolic literacies that see us all connected and nested within larger, harmful capitalist structures. And that's why I started my contribution by talking about our fingerprints. If we identify our fingerprints and the economies of genocide, we start to develop our own metabolic literacies to understand how we are all glued to these harmful capitalist structures. Friends and colleagues, there is no easy answer, but we need to attempt to find an answer to feel the pain of Gaza. And through the pain of Gaza, let Gaza be your lens as you think of questions such as, number 1, whose voices do you teach and reproduce in education? Whose voices are silenced and pushed away or aside because they are deemed irrelevant or apolitical? Number 2, how are inclusion policies developed in your own institution? By whom? Who do they include? Who do they exclude as irrelevant or political? Number 3, do you have a bereavement policy in your institution with a support system that acknowledges ongoing trauma and immense human suffering? Who is excluded? whose grief is seen irrelevant or political? And finally, what's your position in relation to solidarity with the oppressed, with those deemed without rights, with those deemed not humans, not animals, not even trees? What's your position in relation to that? The list is incomplete, but the message is Gaza is entangled with everything we say and do in education. Gaza matters. Without Gaza, our scholarship loses its value. Our education loses its meaning. Our values lose their mooring. Our world loses its order. Our words lose their holding. And with Gaza, we can dare to educate, tell of the harms and wounds. Tell of the harms and wounds, the ongoing attacks on humanity and collective memory. Perhaps one day, perhaps we can find our ways through the ruins, despite the ruins. Thank you.
Before coming to our conclusions in these last 10 minutes, I would like to offer some reflections from my own research. The failures we speak of are felt. They are at root cultural. And this is where we must situate our quest for understanding and the work of repair that can be the vision of education. Genocides always begin culturally before they become political. They are woven into the fabric of language and cultural ideas, which are then used in the education of hate, countered or met with silence and void as failure. Evil, said Hannah Arendt, before she spoke of its banality. Evil, she said, comes from the failure to think and to teach thinking. Genocides are sanctioned or stopped by education. Genocides are sanctioned or stopped by us as one of the key pillars alongside political action. The media are critical in this regard. We educate the journalists, as is higher education and as are religious and cultural institutions, which can, when healthy, under SDG 16, be strong institutions for peace. But they can also become strong institutions for violence, creating the conditions, the sanctioning, the silence, the hate, the failure to allow thinking. Just business and language as usual. Higher education in particular is the training ground for cultural workers, artists, and those who work with the strongest of symbolic systems that we have as human beings, our powers of expression, especially our language. In Gaza, the cultural institutions, the universities, archives, libraries, and cultural centres, together with the journalists and public intellectuals, were the immediate targets. 120 of the people I've worked with over the last 15 years have been killed. Elasticide is a vital constituent of genocide. But through the exceptional work of a handful of academics worldwide, And in response to the Gaza emergency call, a curriculum for education in an emergency has been designed, developed and co-delivered. And I refer here particularly to the work of Professor Nazmi Al-Masri, Professor Giovanna Facetta and Dr. Maria Grazia Imperiale at the Islamic University of Gaza and at the University of Glasgow, which has seen master's students educated, which has seen PhD vivas successfully defended in the Gaza Strip. I refer to the response from applied linguists to the request for teachers online to fill the gaps when colleagues had been assassinated by Israel, and to work of medical educators delivering teaching to those in the hospitals, drafted in as students to treat the wounded and learning alongside, finding a language with which to keep educating despite the Ashlaa. Higher education worldwide is vital to both the prevention of genocide and the rebuilding of higher education. Without it, nothing can be rebuilt. It is the first principle. Without cultural health in education, there's no rebuilding, and this must also be a cultural health sustained by intercultural, multilingual, trauma-informed education. And I'd refer you particularly to the work of my colleague at HBKU in Qatar, Sultan Barakat. In Scotland, one of the most beautiful examples we have, endorsed by the Cabinet Secretary in Scotland, is the work of the Welcoming Languages Project, led by Facetta and Imperiale. Here, teacher educators from Gaza work with Arabic-speaking refugee children and families in Scotland to enable the children to co-design a curriculum through which they would like to teach their primary school teachers and staff, from the head teacher to the janitors to the parent-teacher councils, to speak to them in Arabic, the words of comfort and care when they trip over in the playground and skin their knees, or when they hear that somebody else, somebody anew, has just been murdered. This project was a source of joy and care. It did the work of repair with dignity. It made everybody laugh. Everybody. It works out of the New Scots Refugee Integration Strategy, which has underpinned all of our research, looking at languages for hospitality, for well-being, a language for school, ways of speaking broadly about things that are good for everyone and do the work of unexcluding. This work in the New Scots Refugee Integration Strategy presents work which is trauma-informed, restorative in nature, and importantly, normal. The right to be ordinary, not needing to be exceptional and exceptionally courageous as Khawla and Hyab are today. And it destitutes the violence by creating these oases. In short, it works to keep the peace and augment the peace we already have. In our handbook for integration with refugees, Global Learnings from Scotland, published just last week, you can find many more such examples, not least of work done in, by and with and through communities in a whole society approach, commended by the UNHCR High Commissioner in March 2025 when he visited Scotland. And if you want to take a picture of that, you get the discount. It's also open access and you can share it widely. And that beautiful image on the front was designed by an artist, a Mari Iranian refugee background artist, and his daughter, Carmen. So look, friends and colleagues, often to those cracks that Hyab spoke of, to the non-funded, the voluntary, movement-led education. Community ESOL is so much more than valuable skills. It is food and friendship, bonds, legal advice, gardening, poetry, citizens' advice. It is art and belonging. It is, as many call it, my new family. It is the place where we glimpse from failure pedagogies coming out of Ashlaa. It is edu-caring, and it needs the care of our mainstream education too. Many, many of you, I know, do this work on top of your day jobs. Such an education still finds a way of continuing and showing what Scary speaks of in her work, Thinking in an Emergency, and also in her book on beauty and being just. Elaine Scary was the Harvard Professor of Thought. Wouldn't you just love that title? But in her book, she says, people seem to wish there to be beauty, even when their own self-interest is not served by it. Or perhaps more accurately, people seem to intuit that their own self-interest is served by distant peoples having the benefit of beauty. It's why we submit ourselves to educators who might show us where to stand, she says, as a comet makes its sweep across the sky. So to conclude, in situations of Ashlaa, education often becomes palliative. It develops the art of hospicing the education that has been, and the educational futures that were dreamed of come into being. It strives for a poetics from beyond the abyss that might acknowledge the failures and make room for the same qualities of courage, faith, yes, and determined cheerfulness that we have found in children, students, and colleagues who inspire our work, even in Gaza. From our examples of education undertaken under siege in conflict, and which are often led by refugees, we know the importance of restoring pedagogic normality. We don't have to speak about this all the time. We need to do normal stuff too. The learning that comes from education and emergencies, alongside what we've learned of restorative pedagogies in times of heartbreak, shows us, however, the vital import of pedagogies of care and pedagogies which care for words in a culture of lies, as McIntyre calls it. We know that our work must also be palliative in these days, as Khawla and I write in our article, Hospice in Gaza, that we are required to attend, as Victor Klemperer did during the Holocaust of the Second World War, to the language being taught by the educational masquerade that is the propaganda. Klemperer said, "It is shocking that day after day, naked acts of violence, breaches of the law, barbaric opinions appear quite undistinguished from official decree. And we know, we are exhausted by them. We know there are dangers, as the philosopher Gillian Rose says, not all that plainly, I have to say. If anyone understands her work, please talk to me afterwards. But we know that there are dangers, as she says, in over-remembering, or remembering to excess in the aftermath. What she calls activity beyond activity, and to the point where the horror cannot ever be resolved. In her studies on the work of Holocaust education in Auschwitz as a Jew, she shows how mourning became an activity beyond activity, never ever to be completed. From Holocaust memorial education to remembering Srebrenica, we may critically observe an unresolved need is to stay in an unknowable past of hell, of suffering, of victimhood. Against Derrida's "I mourn, therefore I am," Gillian Rose instead insists that mourning must be completed, and that the work of mourning is, she says, a spiritual political kingdom, the difficulty sustained, the transcendence of actual justice. Genocides succeed absolutely when mourning is not accomplished in all senses of that word. You are not grieving, not reaching for learning, language, arts, friends to care and care with and for, You are waiting for genocide to complete itself, collectively or individually. There must be healing, truth and forgiveness and reconciliation through our educational structures, always. Mourning must be accomplished and learned and taught too. In times of failure and heartbreak, the work of language education too must really struggle. Language which fails as it tries to find words, which, as Podrigo Tuma says in On Being, can be guided by courtesy, poetics, not precision. And when there are no precise words left for the hell that is being endured, education of heartbreak and failure has to do the language work through the propaganda, the lies, the failed curricula, the sticky knowledge, the failed structures of abyss and fear, and find ruderal, marginal places of repair through language pedagogies of care, of serving, of preparing, of sharing, of naming the abyss and the wounds as accurately as our languages. And this happens, as our research has found time and again, we move through an education in hospicing into healing, repair, care, and beauty that persists, without risk of diminishment of suffering or of allowing death to destitute us all of love. So lean in. You can lean in towards that suffering or lean out. It's your choice. You're the only one making it. All is revealed. You can recycle empty propaganda, pretending a superficial peace. Or you can lean in. You can cup your hands, make something of love for the thirsty to drink, allowing yourself, with millions more, to be gripped by the menace of hope. Thank you. There's a question right at the back, and there's a mic right at the back as well.
Thank you very much. I think the silence you are observing is because what we have heard has really made almost all of us speechless. Thank you very much for this wonderful keynote, very powerful. And I was saying to somebody earlier that we are missing this voice, and I'm so glad that we have this in this keynote. So thank you very much for that. I think I would just like to add that we also need to perhaps bring in the critique of the economic system that I think is at the root of so many of our concerns. This genocide is one, but also environmental concern, the increasing wealth inequalities, the weakening of democracies. And I think if you look at each one of them, like all roads led to Rome, here the roads lead to the particular economic system, particular forms of capitalism that have played a major role. And I think this is, again, a place where globally we have to come together to ask questions about this economic system and to stop the consequence we are facing. I just wanted to add that to what you have said. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was a very moving session, and I think that's how education needs to be, moving our emotions, touching, finishing with the anesthetics that we have in this world. So thank you for that. Thank you for bringing Gaza into the picture, and this reflection about the work that we do. I'm sure we all may be already moved by what is happening in Gaza and in other parts of the world, like Sudan or Congo or so many places. And I imagine, maybe I am speaking in plural, but I think there is a worry of what is happening in terms of the rights to protest in this country and the possibility of challenging the government and making the government accountable. So I really just wanted to say thank you. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I think if I could just say something in response to that, Hyab and I feel very lucky at the moment to be living in Scotland, where our Scottish politicians are being very clear that we must work from this place and this acknowledgement of a genocide, but also with a very strong voice. And I know I was preparing some talking points for the Minister today in the Scottish Parliament for a debate on asylum accommodation. And that it's very important to have political leadership. If you look at the 10 points that Genocide Watch produced of the stages of genocide, you see a description of the different stages and then remedial actions. I've used these for a long time through my work in many different parts of the world as a kind of like checklist as to where we are. And there are some real alarm bells at the moment. One of them is the repression of protest or the right to protest, of free speech. Another one is around categorizations and polarizations. All societies are somewhere on that 10-point scale. I'd probably add 11 points following Albanese's reports. And the United Kingdom at the moment is somewhere around about 5. So we are really sounding an alarm bell. And yet there are really good, practical, mitigating things that educators in particular can do, but which also, through accountable structures with our MPs, we can ask to be undertaken on our behalf. And one of those I know is asking our politicians to be very clear in their speech. And we've been successful within Scotland in having that. And we feel very lucky. We also feel protected by that. And I think just from work that I've undertaken through UNESCO on their report on economics and peace, also my friend at the back, thank you for that comment on economics. We were looking at the ways in which economic markers and peace indicators, particularly around intercultural education, collocate. And one of the things that was really interesting was that all the things you would hope would collocate in countries with reasonable GDP were there. But there were 2 really interesting areas where leadership made a difference and where freedom of expression made a difference. And that was where individuals in communities anywhere in the world could make a difference if they were able and given the freedom of expression to speak out and to protest and also to lead, often in ways which were uncomfortable, risky, a little bit crazy. Usually at this point, I ask forgiveness from anybody I've ever line managed Hyab for the slightly quirky ways I line manage people perhaps, but which are a little bit risk-taking. But those are part of the kinds of ways that we might move into places of pedagogies of care. I don't know, Khawla or Hyab, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, I just want to say something about the idea of critique itself. I think some of the things we try to say in this presentation is that it's also a time to move from ideas of critique to questioning. This idea of critique is forcing us to look into answers within the systems themselves, the systems that are creating the base that we're talking about. So how do we then move from just asking, critiquing these systems that are already designed to allow us critique them, to a fundamental idea of questioning them as systems and trying to understand them from their structural and the mechanisms that generate them, rather than just trying to find some critique here and there.
Lots of hands. This always happens. There's a love. It's like playing noughts and crosses right here. Can we go to the question in the middle and then at the back and then come forward to you? And then that might be us for time because I'm mindful that you have, I don't know, networking sessions to go to, I think is what comes next.
Thank you very much for your amazing keynotes. My question would be, what would you say to policymakers here in England or to the government? What is your action point moving on? Thank you.
I've given up on policymakers, and I think the action point needs to be happening at grassroots level, and a lot is happening already. There is a global movement for justice and peace in Palestine. We need to draw on the existing movement and know our language and find our ways to language the world and imagine a different world. That is the message. And I think it's really important for us to be having this discussion as part of one of the largest educational conferences, because as I said in my contribution, education is more than knowledge and skills. It's more than, oh, we've got AI, what do we do? Education is about building the citizens of now and the future. We are the makers of the people around us. So the message isn't to politicians and policymakers who are complicit in the genocide, who benefit from the genocide. The question is not to them. They know what they are doing. The question is to look around us and reclaim our voice and look at ways to exercise our agency. And for that reason, I said in my contribution, I'm not presenting a recipe. Here is how you do. We are all educators. We know how to read our room in our own institutions. We know what's possible and not possible. I always say to colleagues, do Gaza without mentioning Gaza. If you don't feel safe to mention Gaza, still do Gaza. I go to schools and I say the same message to scared hit teachers. I say to them, do Gaza without mentioning Gaza. And many of them are doing that, and they come to me and they say, we feel different. Even though they're not free to actually say Gaza, they do Gaza. So the message is, let Gaza be your catalyst. Explore the affordances of what's doable within your own remits and build allies in your institution and in other institutions. A space like this as BIRA is really important. So thank you, Marlon, for contributing to having this space. I'm sure you've witnessed what BIRA can do.
If I can just come back, I am a policymaker. So I chair the New Scots Refugee Integration Strategy, which is a coalition, a partnership, and an equal partnership of Scottish Government with the Minister for Equalities, the Scottish Refugee Council, which is the third sector umbrella organisation, and the 32 local authorities under the Convention for Local Authorities. We work in partnership. We disagree a lot. These are meetings where I write poetry, like the piece I shared earlier about rolling out. But they're also hugely change-making in that we have seen through partnership working, and particularly with half of the committee I chair being people who are New Scots themselves, who are experiencing the broken asylum system, who know what it means to be one of 10,000 people on a waiting list for ESOL. They are telling us in those meetings with civil servants who've never otherwise had contact with a person seeking asylum or someone on an ESOL waiting list, and working out together what a strategy can look like. And what we see is transformational. What we see is that there's a pilot for free bus travel for people seeking asylum and for young people across the whole of Scotland. What we see is that people can have access and have their fees waived for higher education as a result of conversations in those spaces. It's hard, it's slow, it's endless team calls, but it is worth doing. But at the same time, always, I think, with a question that is an alternative question in mind, because so often policy is imposed by an elite on everybody else. But actually, when together we ask, how do we live in a mutually just and beautiful world, then it changes the terms of how we frame the conversation. And usually we find when we do that, when we work from the strengths approaches that Avril Bellinger and Deirdre Ford particularly have written so well about, we end up in a very different place. Thank you.